Hey, I'm going to read excerpts from John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. He wrote this in 1859, and it's one of the most most eloquent defenses of individual freedom, in which he advances his harm principle, which which says that he's basically trying to explain what when it's appropriate that there should be interference with individual liberty, and he feels it should only be where there's harm to others, and even precludes instances of self-harm which he feels aren't sufficient justification for such um, interference. So I'm reading the introduction still. I'm going to read from the introduction. So yeah, for about 15 minutes. It is proper to state that I forego any advantage which could be derived to my argument from the idea of abstract right as a thing independent of utility. I regard utility as the ultimate appeal on all ethical questions. He's a utilitarian, by the way. I regard utility as the ultimate appeal on all ethical questions, but it must be utility in the largest sense, grounded on the permanent interests of man as a progressive being. Those interests, I contend, authorize the subjection of individual spontaneity to external control only in respect to those actions of each which concern the interest of other people. If anyone does an act hurtful to others, there is a prima facie case for punishing him by law, or where legal penalties are not safely applicable, by general disapprobation. There are also many positive acts for the benefit of others which he may rightfully be compelled to perform, such as to give evidence in a court of justice, to bear his fair share in the common defense, or in any other joint work necessary to the interest of the society of which he enjoys the protection, and to perform certain acts of individual beneficence, such as saving a fellow creature's life, or interposing to protect the defenseless against ill usage, things which, whenever it is obviously a man's duty to do, he may rightfully be made responsible to society for not doing. A person may cause evil to others, not only by his actions, but by his inaction, and in either case, he is justly accountable to them for the injury. The latter case, it is true, requires a much more cautious exercise of compulsion than the former. To make anyone answerable for doing evil to others is the rule. To make him answerable for not preventing evil. Oh, it's amazing how it's amazing how so many of the so I think the Good Samaritan principle I think derives from this, or is it the the brothers? I think is it the brothers keeper, where one maybe may be liable where they're negligent, but they aren't where they fail to intervene, where someone else is by some other external cause going to be hurt. So one isn't obliged to be a brother's keeper. Ah, interesting. I think it derives from this. To make anyone answerable for doing evil to others is the rule. To make him answerable for not preventing evil. Or maybe someone else said it before and it's just electrogenealogy of this work and laying out the project. So I don't know. I'll have to check. To make anyone answerable for doing evil to others is the rule. To make him answerable for not preventing evil is, comparatively speaking, the exception. Yet there are many cases clear enough and grave enough to justify that exception. In all things which regard the external relations of the individual, he is de jure amenable. I think that's maybe Latin, but forgive me, I'm just amenable to those whose interests are concerned, and if need be, to society as their protector. There are often good reasons for not holding him to the responsibility, but these reasons must arise from the special expediencies of the case, either because it is a kind of case in which he is on the whole likely to act better, which left to his own discretion, than when controlled in any way in which society have it in their power to control him, or because the attempt to exercise control produce other evils, oh my God, greater than those which it would prevent. Bruh, these people are prevent. What was he saying? It's hard to say. Yeah. Yeah, Hart was speaking of a German legal philosopher and rebutting that philosopher's position on the distinction between law and morality, and saying he was giving an example of a case in which a woman during Nazi Germany got their husband basically made a false report that resulted in the death penalty for their husband because of the what this philosopher believed to be unjust law. And in the end, when this regime ends and there were attempts at retribution or justice, this woman was found liable for those crimes. And this philosopher, I'm just trying to rehash things here, to be frank, because I'm trying to make the link. So if it doesn't make much sense, but so this philosopher was basically saying of that instance that what happened was just because the woman's actions were wrong themselves. And Hart was against that position, saying it was a worse evil that the law that the woman should be held. Oh, come on, it's evading me, but it's basically analogous to this, where you have a worse judgment. Yeah, it was worse that the woman was being held on those charges, even if the law, without giving justification, without making the weighting, in saying this was the better of two evils. In other words, presupposing that what the woman did was wrong and therefore this act was justifiable, without making the case that it was the better of two evils was a mistake. So I think Mill is making a similar argument, in structure at least. Try and find that argument again. When such reasons as these preclude, where was I? Yeah. When left his own discretion, then when controlled in any way in which society have it in their power to control him, or because the attempt, to control would produce other evils greater than those which it would prevent. Yeah, because the evils Hart was thinking of were in misuse of the law. Something like that. And such reasons as these produce the enforcement of responsibility, the conscience of the agent himself should step into the vacant judgment seat and protect those interests of others which have no external protection, judging himself all the more rigidly because the case does not admit of his being made accountable to the judgment of his fellow creatures. There is a sphere of action in which society, as distinguished from the individual, has, if any, only an indirect interest, comprehending all that portion of a person's life and conduct which affects only himself, or if it also affect others, only with their free, voluntary, and undeceived consent and participation. When I say only himself, I mean directly, and in the first instance, for whatever affects himself may affect others through himself, and the objection, which may be grounded on this contingency, will receive consideration in this sequel. This, then, is the appropriate region of human liberty. It comprises first the inward domain of consciousness, demanding liberty of conscience in the first comprehensive sense, liberty of thought and feeling, absolute freedom of opinion and sentiment on all subjects, practical or speculative, scientific, moral or theological. The liberty of expressing and publishing opinions may seem to fall under a different principle, since it belongs to that part of the conduct of an individual which concerns other people. But being almost of such importance as the liberty of thought itself, resting in great part on the same reasons, is practically inseparable from it. Secondly, the principle requires liberty to taste, requires liberty of tastes and pursuits, of framing the plan of our life to suit our own character, of doing as we like, subject to such consequences as may follow, without impediment from our fellow creatures. You know what's so impressive is these people laying the groundwork. These things sound obvious, especially in the Western world, on which many of these principles, which were informed by many of these principles. But to think these people were saying these things for the first time is brilliant. Without impediment from our fellow creatures, so long as what we do does not harm them, even though they should think our conduct foolish, perverse, or wrong. Hmm. Thirdly, from this liberty of each individual follows the liberty, within the same limits, of combination among individuals, freedom to unite for any purpose not involving harm to others, the persons combining being supposed to be of full age and not forced or deceived. False arrest. No society in which these liberties are not, on the whole, respected is free, whatever may be its form of government, and none is completely free in which they do not exist, absolute and unqualified. The only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts to obtain it. Such is the proper guardian of his own health, whether bodily or mental and spiritual. Mankind are better gainers by suffering each other to live as seems good to themselves than by compelling each other to live as seems good to the rest. Though this doctrine is anything but new, to some persons may have the air of a truism. Mhm. There is no doctrine which stands more directly opposed to the general tendency of existing opinion and practice. Society has expended fully as much effort in attempting, according to its lights, to compel people to conform to its notions of personal as of social excellence. The ancient commonwealths thought themselves entitled to practice, and the ancient philosophers countenanced the regulation of every part of private conduct by public authority on the ground that the state had a deep interest in the whole bodily and mental discipline of every one of its citizens, a mode of thinking which may have been admissible in small republics surrounded by powerful enemies, in constant peril of being subverted by foreign attack or internal commotion, and to which even a short interval of relaxed energy and self command might so easily be fatal that they could not afford to wait for the salutary permanent effects of freedom. In the modern world, to think he was referring to 1859 as it was the modern world, but just funny. In the modern world, the greater size of political communities, and above all, the separation between spiritual and temporal authority, which placed the direction of men's consciences in other hands than those which controlled their worldly affairs, prevented so great an interference by law in the details of private life. But the engines of moral repression have been wielded more strenuously against divergence from the reigning opinion in self regarding than even in social matters, religion, the most powerful of the elements which have entered the formation of moral feeling, having almost always been governed either by the ambition of a hierarchy, seeking control over every department of human conduct, or by the spirit of Puritanism. And some of those modern reformers who have placed themselves in strongest opposition to the religions of the past have been no way behind either churches or sects in their assertion of the right of spiritual domination. M. Comte, in particular, whose social system, as unfolded in his Système de politique positive, aims at establishing, though by moral more than by legal appliances, a despotism of society over the individual, surpassing anything contemplated in the political ideal of the most rigid disciplinarian among the ancient philosophers. Apart from the peculiar tenets of individual thinkers, there was also in the world at large an increasing inclination to stretch unduly the powers of society over the individual, both by force of opinion, tyranny of the majority, both by the force of the opinion and even by, by that of legislation, and as the tendency of all changes taking place in the world is to strengthen society and diminish the power of the individual, this encroachment is not one of the evils which tend spontaneously to disappear, but on the contrary, to grow more and more formidable. Hmm, This is true. My God. Anyways, the disposition of mankind, whether as rulers or as fellow citizens, to impose their own opinions and inclinations as a rule of conduct on others, is so energetically supported by some of the best and by some of the worst feelings incident to human nature that it is hardly ever kept under restraint by anything but want of power. And as the power is not declining but growing, unless a strong barrier of moral conviction can be raised against the mischief, we must expect in the present circumstances of the world to see it increase. It will be convenient for the argument if, instead of at once entering upon the general thesis, confine ourselves in the first instance to a single branch of it, on which the principle here stated is, if not fully, yet to a certain point recognized by current opinions. This one branch is the liberty of thought, from which it is impossible to separate the cognate liberty of speaking and of writing. Though these liberties, to some considerable amount, form part of the political morality of all countries which profess religious toleration and free institutions, the grounds, both philosophical and practical, on which they rest, are perhaps not so familiar to the general mind, nor so thoroughly appreciated by many, even of the leaders of opinion, as might have been expected. Those grounds, when rightly understood, are of much wider application and to only one division of the subject, and a thorough consideration of this part of the question will be found the best introduction to the remainder. Those to whom nothing which I am about to say will be new, may therefore, I hope, excuse me if on a subject which is now 3 centuries, which for now 3 centuries has been often discussed, I venture on one discussion more. Oh dear. It goes into chapter 2 of the liberty of thought and discussion. I think I'll end there. Cheers.